Stephanie had exactly 3 seconds to make a choice. She could keep her head down and stay invisible, or she could step up and save the life of the scariest man in the city. Stephanie was just a waitress working hard to pay her bills and keep her family safe. She didn't want any trouble, and she definitely didn't want to be a hero. But that night at the restaurant, life didn't give her a choice. In one heart-stopping moment, she had to show who she really was. Stephanie chose to save the powerful Mafia boss, Kang Dae, but that one choice put a target on her back and changed her life forever. Hey family, before this story begins, I want you to do something real quick. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your comments fuel these stories. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button because what happens next will leave you speechless. And Happy New Year to every single one of you. Let's start this year with a story that will keep you glued till the very end. The heavy glass doors of the Golden Dragon swung open, and the air in the room died. Kang Dae walked in with a slow, heavy step that made the floorboards groan like a warning. Every fork stopped mid-air, and the usual chatter of the wealthy crowd vanished into a thick, suffocating silence. Stephanie gripped her serving tray until her knuckles turned the color of bone, her eyes locked on the ink crawling up Kang Dae's neck. The black dragon tattooed on his skin seemed to breathe with every pulse of his throat, its tail disappearing under a suit that cost more than Stephanie's childhood home. She watched him scan the room, his eyes moving like a wolf counting sheep before the kill. Kang Dae did not sit until his gaze had touched every exit, every shadow, and finally, her. Stephanie forced her legs to move toward the center table, each step feeling like a walk toward a cliff. She remembered her father's face the night the debt collectors took him away, the same cold silence filling their tiny kitchen before the screaming started. That memory was a fire in her chest, pushing her to keep her head down and her mouth shut so she wouldn't lose everything like he did. She placed the first plate of seared tuna in front of Kang Dae, her hand steady only because she was frozen with fear. The boss didn't look at the food. He looked at the pulse jumping in Stephanie's neck. He leaned forward, the scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain clinging to him like a second skin. "You're late by 4 seconds, Stephanie," Kang Dae said, his voice a low grate that made the hair on her arms stand up. "The kitchen was backed up, sir," Stephanie replied, her voice cracking just enough to show the edge of her terror. "In my world, a delay is usually a trap," Kang Dae whispered, his eyes narrowing into 2 frozen slits. "Is there a trap at my table tonight?" "Only if you consider the fish overcooked," Stephanie snapped back, the words escaping before she could stop them. Kang Dae's lips didn't move, but the air around him grew 10 degrees colder as he stared her down. He reached for his silk napkin, but his hand stopped an inch away from the silver fork. He wasn't looking at her anymore, he was looking at the reflection in the polished surface of his wine glass. Stephanie followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop into her shoes. In the dark glass, she saw the swinging door of the kitchen crack open just an inch. A shadow moved behind the frosted glass, a shape that didn't belong to the head chef or any of the regular staff. It was a tall, jagged movement that sent a shiver of ice down Stephanie's spine. The kitchen door didn't open all the way, but a glint of steel flashed in the gap. Stephanie knew the rules of the dragon. No one enters the floor without a direct order from the floor manager. She looked at the head bodyguard standing behind Kang Dae, but the man was busy watching the front entrance, completely blind to the threat behind him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that told her to run, to hide, to go back to being invisible. But if she did nothing, the blood on the floor tonight would be the same shade as her father's old work shirt. She shifted her weight, her eyes darting back to the wine glass where the shadow was getting larger. "The wine needs to be changed," Stephanie said, her voice louder than she intended. Kang Dae gripped the arms of his chair, his rings digging into the leather with a soft hiss. "I haven't even tasted it yet." "It's been sitting too long," she insisted, her hand reaching for the bottle with a tremor she couldn't hide. "Trust me." Kang Dae's hand shot out like a viper, grabbing her wrist with a grip that felt like a steel vice. He pulled her closer until she could see the tiny flecks of gold in his predatory eyes. The shadow in the kitchen door stopped moving, frozen by the sudden tension at the table. Stephanie felt the cold sweat dripping down her back as the boss's thumb pressed into her bone. He wasn't just holding her, he was weighing her soul to see if she was a savior or a liar. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, the kitchen door swung wide, and a new busboy stepped out with a tray that was far too light. The new busboy moved like a ghost through the dim light of the decanter station, but his hands were too loud. Stephanie watched from the edge of the service bar, her breath hitching as she noticed the way he fumbled with the crystal carafe. He wasn't a student looking for extra cash. He was a shark in a cheap vest. Stephanie felt the familiar, bitter taste of copper in her mouth, the same taste she had when she watched the bank lock the doors on her mother's pharmacy. Back then, she had been too young to fight the men in suits who took everything. Now, the busboy's thumb hovered over the rim of Kangdae's glass, his knuckles turning a guilty white. A silver glint flashed from a hollow ring on the boy's finger as he tilted his hand. Stephanie stood frozen, her eyes wide as a single, heavy drop of clear liquid fell into the deep crimson of the vintage wine. It didn't ripple, it vanished, sinking into the expensive alcohol like a secret. Stephanie's heart slammed against her chest, a trapped bird trying to break her ribs. She knew that liquid wasn't medicine, and it wasn't a mistake. The boy looked up, his eyes darting toward the rival syndicate's table across the room, and Stephanie realized the lounge was no longer a restaurant, it was an execution chamber. "Get back to your station, Stephanie," the floor manager hissed, his hand gripping her shoulder like a claw. "That boy," Stephanie whispered, her throat feeling like it was filled with broken glass. "He's not on the schedule. Here's a temp. Move, or you're fired," the manager snapped, pushing her toward the floor. Stephanie stumbled forward, her mind racing through the math of a murder. It would take exactly 10 seconds for that glass to reach Kangdae's hand. If she screamed, the bodyguards would spray the room with lead, and innocent people would pay for a war they didn't start. If she did nothing, the man who paid the bills that kept her mother's heart beating would be a corpse before dessert. She saw the head bodyguard, a mountain of a man named Minute Ho, look toward the decanter station. Instead of seeing the poison, Minute Ho gave a sharp, professional nod to the busboy, signaling that the boss was ready for his drink. The busboy lifted the tray, his face a mask of cold stone that didn't belong on a 20-year-old. Stephanie felt the sting of sweat in her eyes as she realized the bodyguard was unknowingly escorting the assassin straight to the target. This wasn't just a hit, it was a betrayal from the inside that left Kangdae completely exposed. Stephanie's legs felt heavy, like she was wading through deep water, but she forced herself to pivot toward the center table. She had to intercept the tray before the wine touched the linen, but as she moved, she saw two men at the bar stand up, their hands slipping into their jackets. She was caught in the middle of a pincer move, and any sudden action would trigger a bloodbath. The busboy was 5 steps away from Kangdae, the poisoned wine shimmering under the chandelier like a pool of blood. Stephanie looked at the boss, who was busy scanning a document, his neck tattoos flexing as he worked. He had no idea the air he was breathing was about to be his last. Stephanie's hand went to the heavy tray of appetizers on her own station, her fingers trembling as she prepared to throw her life into the gears of a killing machine. "Wine for the table," the busboy announced, his voice steady and dead. Stephanie lunged forward, but her foot caught on the edge of a heavy chair. As she began to fall, she saw the busboy's hand reaching for the poisoned glass to set it down. If she missed the tray, the glass would land in Kangdae's hand, but if she hit it too hard, the gunman at the bar would open fire on everyone. Stephanie slammed into the busboy's path, her tray of sizzling steak bites acting as a steaming shield. The collision sent a cloud of pepper and heat into the air, forcing the busboy to jerk his arms back to save his balance. This was the same desperate speed she used to grab her sister from the path of a speeding car years ago, the day she realized being careful wasn't enough to keep people alive. Her foot hit the floor with a loud, staged thud, and she let her body lurch forward like a broken doll. Every eye at the table, including Kangdae's cold, predatory gaze, snapped to the spectacle of the clumsy waitress. "Watch where you're going, girl," the busboy growled, his voice a low threat as he gripped his tray of wine. "My apologies, my heel caught the carpet," Stephanie gasped, her voice thick and forced as she leaned into his space. In the half-second that the appetizers clattered on the edge of the table, her hand moved with the oily smoothness of a card shark. She didn't just grab a glass, she danced around the poison, swapping the tainted vintage red for a clean, sparkling water glass from her own cart. The switch was a blur, a ghost of a movement that left the lethal wine tucked safely on the bottom shelf of a service cart, hidden behind a stack of dirty napkins. She stood up straight, smoothing her apron while her heart thrashed against her sternum like a bird in a cage. She had the win. But as she looked down, she saw a crimson stain spreading across her white cuff. The poisoned wine had splashed her skin. Kangdae didn't reach for the water. He sat perfectly still, his neck tattoos rippling as he watched her every move. He didn't look like a man who had just been saved. He looked like a hunter who had just watched a rabbit do something impossible. The silence at the table stretched, thin and sharp as a wire, while Stephanie tried to stop the visible shaking in her fingers. She knew the rules. A waitress in this room was supposed to be a shadow, yet she had just turned herself into the main event. "You've worked here 3 years, Stephanie," Kangdae said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. "You've never tripped once." "Even a machine wears out, sir," Stephanie replied, her throat so tight it felt like it was closing. "Machines get replaced when they start to glitch," he countered, his eyes boring into her skull as if searching for the lie. The busboy didn't wait for the tension to break. He gave a stiff, formal bow and backed away toward the kitchen. He had a smug, hidden smile on his face, believing the boss was seconds away from a final, lethal sip of the glass currently sitting in front of him. Stephanie watched him go, knowing the real assassin was now free to disappear while she was left under the spotlight. She began to wheel her cart away, the poisoned glass rattling against the shelf just inches from her hip. She made it 3 steps before a heavy hand landed on the handle of her cart, stopping her dead in her tracks. Minute Ho, the head bodyguard, wasn't looking at the kitchen. He was looking at the bottom shelf of Stephanie's cart. The white napkins she used to hide the glass were shifting, sliding off the crystal rim as she moved. The dark red liquid shimmered in the low light, reflecting the suspicion in the bodyguard's eyes. Stephanie felt a cold drop of sweat slide down her temple as she realized she hadn't just hidden the evidence. She was now carrying the murder weapon. "Waitress," Minute Ho rumbled, his other hand moving slowly toward the holster under his arm. "What are you hiding on the bottom of that rack?" The water glass sat untouched on the table, but Kangdae's attention was a blade pressed against Stephanie's throat. He didn't reach for the drink. He simply watched the way the light died in the red liquid hidden on her cart. Stephanie felt the sting of salt in her eyes as sweat rolled down her forehead, a physical weight she couldn't shake. This was the same heavy air she breathed the night her father's shop was burned, the smell of smoke, the sound of men who owned the world deciding who got to live. She tried to push the cart, but the wheels felt like they were locked in wet cement under the boss's stare. Kangdae raised a single finger, a slow flick of his wrist that carried the weight of a death sentence. 2 guards stepped away from the shadows, their suits cutting through the dim light as they drifted toward the kitchen and the main lounge exits. They didn't draw weapons, but their posture was a wall of iron that told Stephanie the room had just become her cage. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin cold and tight as she realized her invisibility had finally been stripped away. The boss leaned back, his neck tattoos twisting like live snakes as he tilted his head toward the empty chair across from him. "Come back, Stephanie," Kangdae said, the quietness of his voice more terrifying than a shout. "I have other tables, sir," Stephanie replied, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "The other tables no longer exist," Kangdae countered, his eyes locking onto hers with a force that made her knees buckle. "The only thing that exists is the reason you just turned into a clumsy amateur." Stephanie stepped back toward the table, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Around them, the high society diners began to shift in their seats, the clink of silverware dying out as the Golden Dragon's famous silence turned into a suffocating shroud. She saw a woman at the next table pull her coat tight and look away, a silent signal that Stephanie was already considered a ghost. Every step back to Kangdae felt like a countdown to an explosion she couldn't stop. "Hold out your hands," Kangdae ordered, his voice a low vibration that rattled the crystal on the table. Stephanie obeyed, her fingers twitching with a tremor she hadn't felt since the day she signed away her family's last bit of hope to the debt collectors. She watched her own hands dance in the air, a betrayal of her body that she couldn't control no matter how hard she gritted her teeth. Kangdae didn't touch her. He just leaned in until she could see the cold, calculated hunger in his eyes. He was a man who lived on the edge of a knife, and he had just detected a chip in the blade. 3 years of perfect service, Kangdae whispered, his gaze dropping to her vibrating knuckles. 3 years of being a shadow that never makes a mistake. "Everyone has a bad night," Stephanie said, the lie tasting like ash on her tongue. "Bad nights are for people who can afford to fail," Kangdae snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden, violent heat. "You're shaking because you've seen a ghost, or because you're about to become one." The silence became a physical pressure, a ringing in her ears that drowned out the hum of the air conditioner. Stephanie looked down and saw her own reflection in the table's polished wood, her face pale and her eyes wide with a truth she couldn't speak without starting a war. She realized the win she thought she had, the successful switch, was actually a tether pulling her deeper into the dragon's lair. As she opened her mouth to speak, Minute Ho reached down and pulled the white napkin off the bottom shelf of her cart, exposing the poisoned glass to the light. Minute Ho's hand dived into the lower shelf and came up with the crystal glass. The dark wine swirled inside, thick and heavy, like a pool of drying blood under the chandelier's light. Kangdae didn't blink. He simply watched the glass as if it were a ticking bomb. This was the same look the banker gave Stephanie's mother before he foreclosed on their pharmacy, a cold calculation that saw people as nothing more than numbers to be erased. Stephanie felt the air vanish from the room as Kangdae reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a slender, white ceramic blade. The edge of the knife pressed into the soft skin of Stephanie's neck, the cold bite of the blade forcing her to tilt her head back. She could feel the dragon on his neck pulsing against her own skin, its ink a map of a world that didn't allow for mistakes. Her pulse throbbed against the ceramic, each beat a gamble with her life. She remembered the day she lost her home, the feeling of being pinned down by forces too big to fight, and a sudden, sharp heat rose in her chest. She wasn't that helpless girl anymore. She was the only reason this monster was still breathing. "You swapped the glass because the first one was too slow," Kangdae whispered, the blade nicking her skin just enough to draw a single, hot bead of red. "If I wanted you dead, I would have let you drink," Stephanie said, her voice a low, steady growl that didn't waver. Kangdae's eyes flickered, a momentary glitch in his icy mask as he processed the logic of her defiance. He expected a plea, a scream, or a lie, but she gave him a mirror of his own cold truth. He increased the pressure of the knife, his knuckles white, searching for the fear that usually broke his victims. Instead, he found a woman who had already lost everything once and realized she had nothing left to fear from a man with a piece of sharpened porcelain. Just as the tension reached the point of no return, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. The new busboy was no longer a ghost. He was a rabbit caught in the open, his face twisted in a mask of pure terror. He didn't look at the table. He looked at the exit, his feet skidding on the polished floor as he tried to bolt for the heavy steel doors. Stephanie watched him, realizing that her win had just turned the restaurant into a battlefield. The busboy wasn't just running from a failed job. He was running because he knew what happened to people who missed their mark in this city. He reached the kitchen threshold, his hand stretching for the handle, but the air was suddenly filled with the sound of heavy boots. Minute-Ho moved with a speed that didn't match his size, his body a blurring shadow that cut off the escape route. He didn't use a gun. He used his shoulder, slamming the busboy into the door frame with a sickening crunch of bone against metal. The boy collapsed like a sack of flour, his breath leaving him in a high-pitched wheeze that filled the silent lounge. Stephanie felt the blade at her throat ease just a fraction, but Kangdae's gaze remained locked on her eyes, refusing to let her go. "He was yours," Kangdae accused, his voice a lethal rasp as he ignored the struggling boy in the corner. "He was the one who poisoned the vintage red," Stephanie replied, her eyes never leaving his. "Check his ring." Kangdae didn't look away, but he gave a sharp nod to Minute-Ho, who was already dragging the whimpering boy back toward the center table. The bodyguard grabbed the boy's hand, forcing the fingers open to reveal the hollow silver band that had held the death drop. The busboy began to sob, the sound pathetic and thin in the oppressive silence of the room. Stephanie felt a cold shiver of realization. She had proven her innocence, but she was still the one holding the most dangerous secret in the city. "You saw the drop," Kangdae said, the ceramic blade finally pulling away from her throat, leaving only a stinging line of heat. "Why didn't you just scream for my guards?" Kangdae grabbed the busboy by the hair and slammed the boy's face inches from the wine glass. The crystal rattled against the wood, the dark liquid inside swaying like a deep, red eye. Stephanie watched the boy's pupils grow wide, his breath coming in short, wet gasps that fogged the glass. She felt the phantom weight of her father's hand on her shoulder from the day the bankmen came. He had trembled just like this, a small man crushed by a giant. Stephanie's knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of her service cart, her body a rigid line of survival. "You went through a lot of trouble to pour this," Kangdae whispered, his voice a cold wind in the boy's ear. "It would be a shame to let it go to waste. Drink." "Please," the boy choked out, his voice a thin needle of sound. "I was just told to deliver it. I didn't know." "Then a sip won't hurt you," Kangdae countered, lifting the glass with a slow, steady hand. The busboy let out a broken wail and thrashed his head away, the sheer terror in his eyes confirming the death hidden in the vintage red. The high-end diners at the nearby table scrambled back, their chairs scraping the floor like a chorus of screams. They finally understood that the clumsy waitress hadn't made a mistake. She had stepped in front of a bullet made of liquid. Stephanie felt the weight of 100 eyes on her, but the heaviest gaze belonged to the man with the dragon on his neck. Kangdae reached for a white carnation in the center vase, his fingers snapping the stem with a sharp crack. He tilted the glass, letting a single, dark drop fall onto the snowy petals. The flower didn't just wet. It shriveled, turning a sickly, burnt black in seconds as the toxin ate through the life of the plant. Stephanie felt a cold stone settle in her stomach as she realized how close she had come to touching the liquid herself. She had won the moment, but the look in Kangdae's eyes told her she had just traded a quiet life for a very loud death. "You saved me from a flower's fate," Kangdae said, his eyes scanning the red line on Stephanie's neck where his blade had been. "I saved the restaurant's reputation," Stephanie lied, her voice a brittle shield. "A waitress doesn't risk a ceramic blade for a reputation," he snapped, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his suit. "You risked it for me." The respect in his voice felt more dangerous than the knife, a golden chain he was preparing to wrap around her wrist. Stephanie realized that by seeing the hit, she was now the most important piece of evidence in a war between families. She wasn't an invisible servant anymore. She was a target with a name and a face that every rival in the city would soon memorize. Before she could speak, Kangdae gave a short, sharp jerk of his chin toward the back exit. Minute-Ho dragged the sobbing busboy toward the shadows of the alley, the boy's shoes squeaking across the floor until the heavy steel door thudded shut. The silence that followed was absolute, a void where human life had just been erased from the room. Stephanie looked at the black, withered flower on the table, its petals crumbling into ash under the glow of the chandelier. She turned to leave, her legs feeling like lead, but Kangdae's hand caught her elbow. "The night isn't over, Stephanie," he said, his grip firm and possessive. "And neither is your shift." Minute-Ho signaled the room, and the golden dragon emptied like a punctured lung. In 60 seconds, the wealthy diners were gone, leaving behind half-eaten lobsters and the echo of frantic footsteps. Stephanie stood alone in the center of the vast floor, her apron stained with the shadow of poison and her own sweat. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a hungry beast. She remembered the day the sheriff put the yellow tape across her father's storefront, the same hollow feeling of a world ending in the blink of an eye. Now, the man who owned the shadows was pulling out the chair directly across from him. "Sit," Kangdae commanded, the word hitting the air like a gavel. "I am a waitress, sir, not a guest," Stephanie replied, her voice steady even as her knees threatened to give way. "You are the woman who decided I should keep breathing," Kangdae countered, his eyes tracking the red smudge on her collar. "That makes you the only person in this city with a seat at my table." Stephanie sat, the velvet of the chair feeling like a trap against her back. She had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible, a ghost who cleared plates and vanished into the kitchen. Now, she was sitting in the throne of the condemned, staring into the eyes of a man whose debt was heavier than any bank loan. She thought of her mother's medical bills, the piles of paper that threatened to bury them both, and the desperate need to finally stop running from the wolves. But the look on Kangdae's face wasn't one of gratitude. It was a predatory curiosity that made her skin crawl. "In my world, a life saved is a transaction," Kangdae said, leaning forward until the candle flame danced in his dark pupils. "Name your price, Stephanie." "I don't have a price," she snapped, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the silk tablecloth. "Everyone has a price, especially those who pretend they don't," he pushed, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "I didn't do it for your money," Stephanie whispered, her throat burning with the memory of her father's pride. "I did it because I'm tired of watching good things die while people like you just watch." Kangdae flinched as if she had struck him with a ceramic blade. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by men who would sell their mothers for a fraction of his power, yet here was a woman who saw him as nothing more than a failing conscience. The air between them grew thick with a new kind of tension, a shift in power that neither of them expected. He reached for the busboy's employee file, a thin folder that represented a life he had already decided to end. He didn't read it. He simply held the edge of the paper over the flickering candle. The paper curled and blackened, the smell of burning ink filling the empty room as the history of the assassin vanished into ash. Stephanie watched the fire, realizing that her win, surviving the hit, had just bound her to a man who erased people as easily as breathing. She had saved a monster, and in doing so, she had invited him into the wreckage of her own life. Kangdae dropped the burning remains into a crystal ashtray and looked at her with a chilling, newfound respect. "My own blood relatives want me in a box," Kangdae said, his voice dropping to a rasp. "And a stranger with a serving tray is the only one who didn't let it happen." "That doesn't make us friends," Stephanie said, rising from the chair as if it were made of hot coals. "No," Kangdae agreed, his gaze moving to the window where a black SUV had just pulled onto the curb. "It makes you a target for every man who wants to see me fall." Stephanie turned to the door, but the reflection in the glass stopped her cold. Two men she didn't recognize were standing under the street lamp across the road, their eyes fixed directly on her. She hadn't just saved a life. She had inherited a war that was only just beginning. Stephanie stepped out of the golden dragon, the cold night air hitting the red line on her neck like a spray of needles. She didn't need a mirror to know she was marked. She could feel the phantom pressure of Kangdae's blade every time she swallowed. This was the same suffocating feeling of the night the landlord nailed the eviction notice to her door, a moment where the world decided she no longer had a place to hide. She hurried toward her apartment, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the pavement, but the street was too quiet. As she turned the corner to her building, she saw two black sedans idling at the curb, their headlights cutting through the fog like the eyes of deep-sea monsters. The lobby of her apartment building was no longer hers. 3 men in sharp, charcoal suits stood by the elevators, their hands folded in front of them with the practiced stillness of hunters. Stephanie's knuckles turned white as she gripped her bag, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She remembered her mother's trembling voice when the debt collectors used to call, a sound of pure, helpless static. She tried to walk past the men, but the tallest one stepped into her path, his face a mask of polite iron that told her she was no longer a private citizen. "Your floor is secure, Miss Stephanie," the man said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "Secure from who?" Stephanie snapped, her voice cracking with the strain of a dozen different fears. "From anyone who isn't us," he replied, pressing the elevator button for her as if he owned the building and everything inside it. She bolted into her apartment and slammed the door, but the safety she expected was gone. On her kitchen table sat a stack of envelopes, all of them stamped with the word paid in thick, crimson ink. Her mother's surgery bills, the back rent, the predatory loans that had kept her awake for 1,000 nights, all of them were dead and buried. This should have been the win she had prayed for, the miracle that saved her family from the gutter. But as she flipped to the bottom of the stack, she found a bank slip showing a zero balance and a note that read, "A life for a life." The cost of her freedom was a golden cage, and the bars were already closing in. She walked to her bedroom, her legs feeling like they were made of lead, and found a small, rectangular box sitting on her pillow. Inside was a scarf made of hand-woven silk, the color of a bruised plum, designed to hide the mark Kangdae had left on her skin. She wrapped the fabric around her throat, the silk feeling like a cold hand, a reminder that the boss now owned the very air she breathed. Just as she tightened the knot, the television on her wall flickered to life, showing a news report of a massive fire at a warehouse across town. The warehouse belonged to the rival syndicate that had sent the bus spore, and now it was a pillar of orange flame. Kangdae wasn't just protecting her, he was erasing the world that had tried to hurt him, and he was using her act of mercy as his excuse for a massacre. Stephanie watched the screen, her stomach churning as she realized her good deed had lit the fuse on a citywide war. She was no longer the invisible waitress who survived by being small, she was the spark that had burned down an empire. The realization hit her like a physical blow, making her lungs ache with a sudden, sharp lack of oxygen. She reached for her phone to call her mother, but the screen was already glowing with an incoming call from an unknown number. Her fingers trembled so violently she almost dropped the device, the cold plastic feeling like a piece of ice in her palm. She didn't want to answer, but she knew that in this new order, a ringing phone wasn't an invitation, it was a command. She pressed the phone to her ear, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. "The dragon is hungry, Stephanie," a voice rumbled, the low tone of Minute-Ho sending a shiver down her spine. "I quit," she whispered, the words sounding hollow and pathetic even to her own ears. "You don't quit a debt this size," Minute-Ho countered, the sound of a car door closing echoing through the line. "There is a car downstairs. The boss is waiting at the lounge, and he doesn't like to wait alone." Stephanie pushed through the heavy doors of the Golden Dragon, the plum-colored silk scarf hiding the mark on her neck like a secret. The floor manager, a man who once spent his shifts barking at her to polish the silver, froze in his tracks and bowed so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. Stephanie didn't stop to acknowledge him, her heels clicking against the marble with a sharp, rhythmic snap that signaled the end of her time as a ghost. She remembered the day she begged for an extra shift just to buy her mother's medicine, only to be laughed out of the office. Now, the same arrogant waiters who used to trip her in the kitchen backed away, their eyes glued to the floor as if she carried a loaded gun. Kangdae sat at his central table, his silhouette framed by the city lights that shimmered through the high-rise glass. 2 glasses of vintage red were already poured, the deep crimson liquid catching the light like twin pools of fresh blood. Stephanie approached the table, her heart slamming against her ribs not with the old fear, but with a cold, electric focus. This was the same feeling she had when she watched the bank take her father's pride, the moment she realized that in this world, you are either the hammer or the nail. Kangdae didn't look up, but he slid the second glass toward the empty chair across from him. "The room looks different from this side of the apron, doesn't it?" Kangdae asked, his voice a low, Vibrating rasp. The air is thinner up here, Stephanie replied, her fingers brushing the stem of the glass but not picking it up. It's the air of survival, he countered, finally looking up with eyes that held a dark, terrifying respect. From this moment on, no plate touches my table and no bottle is uncorked unless your hands are the ones to do it. Stephanie felt the weight of the promotion settle on her shoulders like a leaden cloak, a wind that carried a permanent cost. She was no longer a waitress working for a paycheck. She was the internal security, the only human shield the dragon trusted. This meant she would never walk home alone again, never go to a grocery store without a shadow, and never see her mother without a guard at the door. She looked at the tattoos on Kangdae's neck, and for the first time, the dragon didn't look like a monster. It looked like a wall of scales, a suit of armor designed to keep a broken heart from leaking out. You're making me the most hated person in this building, Stephanie said, her knuckles turning white as she leaned over the table. I'm making you the most untouchable person in this city, Kangdae corrected, his thumb tracing the rim of his glass. And if I fail to catch the next drop, she challenged, her voice a sharp blade in the quiet room. Then we go down together, he whispered, a twisted smile ghosting across his lips as he raised his glass in a silent toast. Stephanie didn't sit. She moved to his right side, standing just behind his shoulder where she could see every entrance and every shadow. Her eyes, once trained to look for crumbs and empty water glasses, now scanned the room for the glint of steel and the tremor of a nervous hand. She saw a busboy she didn't recognize near the bar and felt the stinging of sweat at her hairline, her body coiling like a spring. She was the ghost who had finally learned how to haunt the living, a protector born from the ashes of her own trauma. The lounge doors opened, and a group of rival associates entered, their faces hardening the moment they saw Stephanie standing beside the boss. They recognized her face from the night before, and the way they hesitated told her everything she needed to know. She was no longer a victim of the city's cruelty. She was the one who decided who lived and who died at the dragon's table. As the rivals took a seat in the far corner, Stephanie felt a cold, metallic taste in her mouth and reached for the small, ceramic knife Kangdae had placed near her hand. They're watching us, Stephanie murmured, her gaze locking onto the leader of the rival group. Let them watch, Kangdae replied, his voice dripping with a dark, satisfied pride. They're not looking at me anymore, they're looking at you. Stephanie felt the shift in the room's gravity, a heavy pressure that told her the hunt had officially begun. She was the most protected woman in the city, but as she watched the rival's hand slip toward his jacket, she realized her life would never be her own again.